Hello everyone, and welcome to the TEDxWarwick Student Event 2021. Thank you so much for tuning in, whether that's by live stream, YouTube or Instagram. This year's theme is a matter of time. We talk a lot about time. We work against it, we run out of it and we enjoy it. Sometimes time runs fast, and other times it runs slow. Sometimes it feels like we have plenty of time, and at other points it feels like there's not enough to achieve everything that we wish to achieve. Everything really is a matter of time, and no one understands that better than our 4 student speakers and our student performer that we have lined up for you today. Each of them will share unique ideas on what time can teach us. In the next hour, expect to hear talks from philosophy to film. You can expect to hear a testimony of resilience and a talk on the interconnectedness between politics, biology and time. We also have some happy tunes lined up for you, which hopefully will transport you through time from the comfort of your own homes. Let's get started. Our first student speaker is Keely Ball, a first year film student. In her talk, Keely will be delving into the debate surrounding trigger warnings. She'll discuss how they've developed over time, their place in the future of film and TV, and what it really means to be seen on screen. Without further ado, here's Keely Ball.
Over the past 20 years, I have seen the media I consume grow with me. I have seen myself in stories, in character, and I have seen the artistic communication of different realities. As time has shifted, we have shifted with it too, and media products have followed suit. Our awareness contributes to the media's awareness. But sometimes we may become aware of things accidentally. This can serve a much greater purpose further down the line, but in the moment, the impact it could have is unprecedented. I learned that the hard way. When I was 11, I discovered what self-harm was through a YouTube video me and some classmates had randomly stumbled across. It appeared out of the blue, and in that moment, I had been exposed to something quite frightening for my age. And as I would later learn, the reality of many young people across the world dealing with suicide and self-harm. So let me pose a maths problem. If 5 seconds of that one image hasn't left my head in almost 10 years, how long, on average, would it take for an 11-year-old to forget the 3-minute graphic suicide scene in 13 Reasons Why? 13 Reasons Why is a Netflix teen drama show based on a novel of the same name. The premise was about a teenager who had tragically committed suicide, and prior to this had recorded 13 cassette tapes. Her 13 reasons why she was ending her life. But was the adaptation of suicide we were presented with, however, a carefully planned or considered representation? I personally didn't think so. It seemed that many people on social media didn't think so either, and many people I spoke to in real life shared the same concerns. This isn't the first time film and television has depicted suicide and self-harm in this manner. Extremely graphic and lengthy scenes of self-injury or the act of suicide have been prevalent in visual mediums for years. It is only at this point in time that many people have begun to question the effectiveness of this approach. So of course, this poses the question, why? Why do film and television producers decide to include such traumatizing visuals in shows, especially when they are geared towards teenage demographics? You may think that an explicit approach has the biggest impact, or that filmmakers are trying to capture the reality of a situation that many young people experience. But could unnecessarily violent scenes of self-harm and suicide be causing more harm than good? That is my question for you to think about today. So, let's look at some statistics. In a 2019 press release, the National Institute of Mental Health claimed that there was a 28.9% increase in suicide rates among 10 to 17-year-olds following the month the show was released. According to this report, the number of deaths by suicide in this time frame was larger than any other month in a 5-year period. Considered along other factors such as previous trends of suicide rates or relevant social or economic trends, the study leaned towards supporting that suicide rates could have been influenced by the show's content. However, the accuracy of the study was heavily debated, with alternative reports claiming that this was based off a faulty premise. In relation to this, in a 2017 research letter, the Journal of the American Medical Association Network discussed internet search trends following the release of the show. They reported a cumulative 19% increase in suicide queries in the 19 days following its release, with the biggest increases on an individual basis being seen in questions of suicidal ideation. So, while the show was successful in raising awareness about suicide and starting a conversation about mental health, it could be argued that the unintentional causation based off this research was an increase in suicidal ideation or behaviour in the relevant demographic. So, there are existing media guidelines in place to prevent this sort of situation arising. In a 2019 resource, the World Health Organization advised filmmakers to avoid presenting the act of suicide. In addition to this, they advised providing a content warning on any potentially graphic material, as well as consulting with suicide prevention experts and mental health professionals. Building upon this, in 2020, the UK-based suicide prevention charity Samaritans published their guidance on depictions of suicide and self-harm in drama and film. They stated that in order to protect vulnerable individuals who may be suffering from suicidal ideation, the details should be carefully considered and excessive coverage should be avoided. Many believed that such a graphic suicide scene in a teen drama fit this description. That is why, after much criticism and concern from mental health professionals, the suicide scene was removed from the show for the safety of future viewers. So this decision could have been perceived as an act of censorship. According to the National Coalition Against Censorship, this occurs whenever words, images, or ideas that are found to be offensive are suppressed on the basis of a group's political or moral values. But is safeguarding a political issue? Is making sure a vulnerable teenager doesn't accidentally stumble across graphic self-harm in a teen drama a case of being offended? I personally think not. But regardless, I know what you might be thinking. So you want us to censor art? That's actually not what I'm here to advocate for. As a film student, I understand the importance of art that explores topical issues of all complexities and severities. I want film and television to represent the unrepresented as it has done for many years and will continue to do so for many more. But does that really mean we have to be careless in our approach? The last thing we need to do is to stop talking about these issues, especially when discussing them in film or television shows. But the longer we violently present serious issues such as self-harm and suicide for the so-called shock horror value, the more we unconsciously contribute to the stigma, and that doesn't help any of us. If we are to truly be the creatives we say we are, we need to start coming up with creative solutions. We have so much artillery at our disposal thanks to the art forms that contribute to the making of a film or television show. Our cinematographers, our sound recordists, our writers, our directors, the way we can use camera composition to plant a hidden meaning, or the way we can write to our heart's content and bleed pain onto a page and turn it into poetry. If we are to truly be the creatives we say we are, we need to tackle these issues with creativity in order to make room for accessibility. If the times are changing and the media is changing with it, then I see no excuse for why we can't change our approach. So when the advocacy for trigger warnings is too much to ask, what isn't too much to ask? How can we make sure that violent depictions of suicide and self-harm are reconsidered and a safer approach is adopted in order to protect vulnerable viewers? But before we discuss that, we need to establish what it means for somebody to be triggered in a way that we can all understand. Your understanding of what being triggered means will vary based upon the interpretation you've been exposed to. To be triggered usually means to be overly offended in contemporary conversation. It can also be used to describe the feeling of anger or irritation, but it is mostly used to poke fun at those who are vocal about what is important to them. Being triggered is actually related to the activation of a trauma trigger, which could be any stimulus which reminds an individual of a traumatic event, be it visual, auditory, or through other sensory experiences. So, let's talk about trigger warnings. They make for a huge argument in the field of academia. Trigger warnings have been criticised due to fears that they may have negative consequences for academic conversation. They may prevent students from exploring the harsh realities of the world which their studies will expose them to. However, students have already been exposed to these harsh realities. A lot of students have already lived through them. Due to this, trigger warnings serve as an indication of distressing content, which can help guide students through their next steps. However, if the student ultimately decides that their next best step is not to engage with the content because of significant personal reasons, we shouldn't place shame on them. Trigger warnings help an individual mentally prepare for discussions or depictions of topics that are traumatic or sensitive for them. Triggers that are helpful to indicate include depictions of self-harm, suicide, and sexual or racial abuse. I understand that some of you may be able to think of arguments that exist against trigger warnings. A common symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder is trying to avoid reminders of the traumatic event. Due to this, many believe that the provision of a trigger warning encourages an unhealthy avoidance, as opposed to aiding an individual's recovery. Many believe that instead of relying on trigger warnings, individuals with trauma should seek professional help, but it's not always as simple as that. According to MHFA England, 20% of young people with mental ill health wait more than 6 months to receive care from a specialist. Suicidal ideation does not have a 6-month waiting room for you to sit in. Teenagers suffering from this issue do not have 6 months to wait. But if that isn't shocking enough for you, let me present to you an article I read a week ago. If the fact that children as young as 10 have self-harmed or attempted suicide doesn't alarm you enough, where do you think they might have seen this behaviour? This issue runs so deeply within our society, and so many, old or young, have been impacted by these issues. And with private therapy costing hundreds of pounds and UK university wellbeing services being both overwhelmed and understaffed, I do not understand how therapy is apparently more accessible than a 30-second word of caution. I do not understand. So advocating for this issue can cause the same backlash as advocating for any other issue can cause. Not only are we triggered for wanting trigger warnings for people who could genuinely be triggered, we are also titled as snowflakes. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, the term snowflake generation describes young people who are considered to be too easily offended. But are we really the snowflake generation? Or are we just the generation that actually cares? I once took this debate around trigger warnings to somebody who had links to the television industry. I was told I was completely incorrect, and that self-harm, suicide, and other similar issues should be shown in their most explicit and shocking format. This made me curious about the power of stopping and thinking about how it must feel in somebody else's shoes. Because before I can even finish expressing that a lack of informed and dangerous filmmaking could have a negative impact, I am being told that I'm a snowflake. Before we can even set up the foundations of our house, there is a foot in our door. Why aren't we stopping and thinking before we say somebody is triggered for fighting for somebody's choice to protect their well-being? Why are we presuming that students haven't already been exposed to the harsh realities of the world when students are experiencing them on university campuses? But despite all of this, we are called snowflakes. So, how about we look at some solutions? Firstly, we need to turn to the professionals. I am just a student advocating for a cause much larger than myself. As much as I want this issue solved, I alone am not qualified enough to solve this by myself. We need to open up a discourse about trigger warnings that is much more educational and insightful. We need to listen to those from both sides participating in this said discourse and reserve our usage of the terms snowflake and triggered for their respective uses. We need to advocate for change. Secondly, this conversation needs to translate to the film and television industry. If we truly believe that this is a suppression of creativity, then we need to be much more creative on how we combat these issues. We need to embrace our creativity and use it to advocate for positive change. We are the masters of the art of suggestion, so let's utilize our skill sets, our technologies, and our resources. Let's advocate for change. And finally, I propose the idea of a content advisor. Feel free to rework the name if necessary, but do not change what it stands for. We've seen massive advancements in this industry thanks to the introduction of intimacy coordinators. Let's provide productions that cover topics such as suicide and self-harm with professionals who receive dedicated training in regard to the development of sensitive material. Let's call on organisations to publish practical guidelines. Let's have the content advisors suggest revisions and reworks, lead informative sessions to the production team, and create safe spaces for cast and crew who might be affected. We can defeat the stigma with more creative, carefully considered and cooperative approaches, but we have to be prepared to work for it. We need to realise how much good this could do. So, if advocating for positive change, a safe approach to our filmmaking practices, and better education around mental health and how it should be presented makes me offended, then that is okay. If advocating for a student's right to say, this is too much due to personal trauma, makes me a snowflake, then that is also okay. There are many names under the sun for us who fight for the causes we believe are the right ones to defend. But we care. And that stands for a much bigger purpose than calling someone a snowflake. We care. So, in regard to trigger warnings, whether you agree with me, disagree with me, or haven't made your mind up just yet, that is okay. These things take time, but with time comes opportunity. Opportunities to educate ourselves, opportunities to use an empathetic ear. It's okay if we haven't done this before. What matters is how we go forward. We have an opportunity today. There is no time like the present. Let's be creative in regards to how we can create change. Over the past 20 years, I have seen the media I consume grow with me. Today, I am asking for it to grow some more, and I am asking for the fight to become stronger. And I will continue to ask, and I will continue to advocate. That is the least I can do. Change is possible, we just have to believe in it. There is no time like the present.
Thank you, Keely, for that extremely powerful talk. Our second speaker, Jordan Jones, is a part-time student at the Centre for Lifelong Learning. Jordan's talk, 3 Lessons from Beyond, will walk us through 3 life lessons he learnt from the deaths of loved ones who sadly passed. Jordan will talk about how these lessons that we teach ourselves and learn from others can be timeless and last beyond death. Here's Jordan.
60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 24 hours in a day. 403,200 minutes to have a baby takes to develop in the womb. In the UK, the average human being is alive for 709,560 hours. It's been 1,852 days since my dad died. 1,560 since my grandfather passed. And 1,192 days since my cousin Evan sadly lost his life. They say time heals, but we also hear that time flies. Time doesn't sound as if it has much time, if you ask me. Especially as we're often reminded that time doesn't stop for anyone. So it makes me wonder, would that be the same for a life that is no longer? We're comforted by the idea of an afterlife, to be united with our loved ones that we miss so dearly. But if I'm honest, the thought lingers. What if I weren't to see them again? What becomes of a life that is no longer? One thing I can say for sure is that memories are ours to keep. Almost superhero-like powers allow us to travel through space and time, through pictures, videos, reliving scenes in our mind, and often able to smell the air as if we were there again. Love, a feeling indescribable, warms the heart, here with us now and forever. I feel the most important gift from a life that is no longer are lessons. Great minds of the past still here today, helping shape the world that we see. I'm talking millions of individuals like me and you that have came before us, each contributing immensely to build the world that we see today, whether big or small. Earlier I mentioned 3 individuals that contributed so much to my own life. They gave a lot when they were here, and even more now they've passed. I miss them dearly, and at a drop of a hat I'll do anything to have them back. But with a certainty that is branded on my heart, I stand proud to relive their final moments of life and share how their death has brought life back to me. I want to share lessons passed on from the end of life, lessons from the dead to be used by the living, lessons unbounded by time. The first lesson came from my dad, Mark Jones. Appreciate the small, big things. In January 2016, after what seemed to be a bit of flu, my dad's health took a turn for the worse and he was rushed into hospital. After hearing the news, I remember time freezing for a moment, almost in a trance-like state. Now, I hadn't been given much detail, but for some reason I feared the worst. I remember rushing to the hospital. Time definitely wasn't on my side. Between learner drivers and red lights, it felt like a lifetime before I arrived. I finally got there to be greeted by my family, who had all got there before me. Clearly didn't encounter many learner drivers on their way up. So just for the record, anyone that is learning to drive, I've been there, so it's not in any way a dig. So the situation was, he had developed pneumonia and his blood had turned acidic. He was at real risk of cardiac arrest. For that reason, they decided they were going to place him in an induced coma. My dad spent 100 days in intensive care. Now what's handy for the lesson is that the nurses kept a diary those days. And I'm going to share some of those moments that granted me the lesson, appreciate the small, big things. Day 21, my dad was woken up. But because he was struggling to breathe, he had to have a tube inserted into a hole into his neck. Painful to look at, but it was what was keeping him alive. And I'm sure you can imagine the joy I felt being able to see him awake after fearing the worst. The problem we had, because of this tube, he couldn't speak. He had a million questions, but no way of asking them. So, after a lot of failed attempts and a lot of frustration, we found a new way to communicate through hand gestures and my poor lip reading skills. Something they're not always perfect, and often creating fits of laughter because how far away I was from what he was saying. Oh, you love me, Dad? When in actual fact he was saying, I want to watch the TV. Something small, but it was appreciated. Day 75, I receive a call from the nurse. Jordan, I've got some amazing news. Go on, what is it? Your dad's had a wee. It was my dad's first time being able to pass urine by himself since arriving to the hospital. Now, I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but it was amazing news. I remember visiting him that evening, high-fiving the nurse as I walked in, giving him that biggest hug ever. That smile on his face, that sense of achievement was there for all to see. Again, something small, but it was appreciated. Day 98. After making some amazing progress, the doctors wanted him to start moving around more. We decided we were going to try and get him outside. Still attached to the life support machine, but we found a way. Well, my daddy had other ideas, very stubborn man. He actually pretended he was asleep when I arrived so we didn't have to go outside. For a man that hadn't seen daylight for 98 days, he was adamant. So, after a bit of skillful negotiation, which included emotional blackmail, he finally woke up from his pretend sleep. We got him in a chair and off we journeyed through the ward. Every nurse we passed beamed joy. We finally got there, to the fire exit of the ward. We opened the doors, freezing cold and rain. I kid you not, we spent 5 seconds outside, look at each other, burst out laughing and hurry back in. As I left my dad that day, which unknown to me would be the last day I saw him alive, that smile on his face will forever be one of my fondest memories of my dad. Something so small, but so big. And that's why I present you the first lesson from the dead, Mark Jones. Appreciate the small, big things. The second lesson came from my granddad, Reg Durant. Be proud of the life you live. This lesson again was given to me at the end of life. My granddad had battled lung cancer for around 9 months, and after some difficulties at home, he was rushed into hospital and immediately placed onto the intensive care ward. It was actually the same ward where my dad had passed away in. The nurses visibly taken back by my arrival, but so warm and welcoming to me and my family. The doctor sat us down with my granddad present and delivered the news. It was unlikely that my granddad would live longer than 48 hours. My nana and my mum immediately burst into tears. Yet my granddad didn't move. I sat there watching him process the news of his death. His life had been given an expiry date, his hands clasped together and his thumbs rotating over one another. After a few minutes, he looks up and he says, "Jordan, go to the shop and get me some boxers. If I'm dying, I'm not doing it with everything on show." My nan and mum immediately stopped crying. I think they were shocked by his response to the news. But then again, my granddad would wear a hat and a suit everywhere he went, so why should now be any different? I replied, "No problem," and immediately set off with my very first glimpse of the lesson, be proud of the life you live. After the arrival of his boxers, my granddad seemed ready, but there was a predicament. My auntie, his daughter, had been on holiday in Malta, and after hearing the news was able to source an emergency flight back home. The problem was she wouldn't arrive until late the next evening. My auntie would be devastated not to see my granddad before he passed. But my granddad seemed ready, his face covered by an extremely tight mask. You could see the discomfort in his eyes. I was given the job of informing him about my auntie's attempts in returning to see him. I meekly approached him, took a deep breath, and I said, "Look, Granddad, Auntie's been able to get a flight home, but she ain't going to be here until tomorrow evening. So you're going to have to postpone your death until she arrives." He smiled, held out his hand and held on to mine. He said, "Of course." I believed him. There was something so calming about him. Here he was on the brink of death, but still had the strength and courage to hold on that little longer so he could see his daughter one last time. That was a proud man. Proud of his achievements, proud of the family he'd created, and willing to sacrifice his own comfort for his love of others. Be proud of the life you live. The time had arrived. My granddad had his boxers and his family. He was ready. The nurse was preparing my granddad as we all sat beside him crying silently. The nurse, who happened to be the same nurse that oversaw my dad's final moments, gave him a bit of pain relief to provide him a moment of comfort as he eased into an eternal sleep. You could see him slowly leaving when my cousin hysterically shouted, "No, Grandad, you can't leave me." My granddad awoke from his death. He looked up and said, "It's okay. It's my time to go to sleep." He opened his arms, my cousin collapsing his head onto his chest. My granddad rubbing his head and he whispered, "I'm proud of you." He died minutes later. I present you the second lesson from the dead, Reg Durant. Be proud of the life you live. The third lesson came from my cousin Evans. This lesson doesn't have the same storyline attached to it. It wasn't given to me directly by my cousin, it was something that his death had left me with. After a normal night out with friends, My cousin returned home a little worse for wear. He'd collapsed and was taken to the hospital. Not long after, we were told he wasn't going to wake up. He'd had a brain aneurysm, only 32 years of age. His life ending way too soon. The lesson? Don't leave things undone and unsaid. I say a cousin, but it felt more like a brother. And I'm sure you can relate, with such a close bond, sometimes comes disagreements. And sometimes those disagreements boil over into periods of time where you don't speak to one another. We were experiencing that moment in time. We were not on speaking terms. How stubborn we were. To have so many amazing memories together, for it to end the way it did was a tragedy. We'd both taken time for granted, as we often do, and things I wish I'd said or done, I no longer had the time to do. Of all the lessons my cousin gave me, and even perhaps all the lessons I've shared with you today, this was the most valuable. Evan's notice: don't leave things undone or unsaid. You'll recall earlier I started off with some statistics around time, and I'd like to share some more. 250 babies are born in a minute. On average per minute, 108 people die. Around 80 minutes will have passed by the time I start speaking. That's 4,500 babies being born and 1,944 people that would have died. Imagine all the lessons left to us by those people in such a short space of time. And for those babies just being born, imagine all the lessons yet to be learnt. We live in a world full of knowledge, but all knowledge is experience lived and passed on. I want you to take a moment and think of somebody in your own life that you've lost. What lesson did they leave? What lessons have been left to us here in the present from those no longer here? Give them a voice. Let them be heard. And now I want you to take a moment and look at your own life. If there could be one lesson you leave this world, what would it be? What is it that you want to pass on? What do you want to teach? It doesn't even have to be anything out of the ordinary. It could be to smile more, or even that it's okay to cry. The lessons left to me were like silent whispers. How easy they could have been overlooked amongst the grief and sorrow. Appreciate the small, big things. Be proud of the life you live. Don't leave things undone or unsaid. But I found them and have changed my life. I encourage you to try and find the lessons that may have been passed to you and share them as I have done today. Don't let the end of life mean the end of impact. Don't let time define what you can learn or teach someone else. Don't let the end of time mean the end of you. So I think if there was one lesson that I would like to leave you all with, it would probably be nice to learn as drivers. Thank you so much for listening to me today.
Thank you, Jordan, for that moving, inspiring story. Next, we'll hear from a young, rising producer and musician. Dylan Kenny, otherwise known as Odd Tropic, creates happy, uplifting music. He's a PPE first-year student and continued to make his music through lockdown. In fact, Dylan released his latest Spotify EP just earlier this week. His performance will show us how music can really transport one through time. Hope you enjoy.
Hello. My name is Dylan Kenny. I make music under the name Odd Tropic. I've been listening to music my whole life. However, only recently I've fallen in love with compositions and adding lyrics and vocals over these tracks. Something I love to do as well is making music for people to enjoy, to uplift. And something I found very tough was to make music for different age ranges and generations. I struggle a lot with making music for much older people. So in that case, it made me think, why is it that their taste differs to ours? Because at the end of the day, we're all people. So it made me think maybe it's not the taste, but the society around them that molds the way that they think and their passions and what they're driven by, and that's what music reflects. And so in that case, I hope I can take you on a musical journey, designated a little composition that I've made, produced, and vocalized over to represent each decade from the 1940s to now. And yeah, I hope you enjoy. I can't keep on chasing. I'll only say it one more time. Come on, let's face it. It's too late to be asking why. I'm sure you'll be fine, but leave the light on just for me, 'cause I realized that there's something I can't see. So starting off in the 1940s, when the majority of World War II took place, was when there was a lot slower, jazzy melodies infused with a centralized theme of love in the lyrics, with recognizable names to this day, such as Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong. However, what intrigued me was the formation of a cappella groups, such as the Four Freshmen, who would stack melodies and harmonies using simply their voices. Perhaps you could hear the layered vocal harmonies and corny lyrics in my version as well. However, in the 1950s, rock and roll became much more prevalent.
Oh, you never guess what I found. Just a simple sound, oh, when the music's playing loud. I wanna dance around. Either I kiss her then I lose, or I'm missing out on who in the worst kind of way. Go ahead and shoot up. Wanna see you loosen up. Shoot up. Come on and kick those heels up high to the 50s child.
So rock and roll surged in popularity, not only musically but socially. Packing songs with energetic vocals, fast-tempo electric guitars, and snappy drums led to the empowerment of younger generations. They were able to appreciate the influence of African American styles, no matter the race of the performer or the audience. It commercialized the merging of different styles to create a common culture between white and black teenagers. And the more sexualized lyrics and vibrant percussion allowed for artists such as Elvis Presley and later Jimi Hendrix to take over the rock and roll scene. But in the 1960s, this energy was transformed into something even bolder, breaking away from the social norms, revolutionizing music.
Yeah, you like the chaser. I got nothing more to say. I wanna take you back, but I don't want it like that. No. Yeah, I got a fixer, that's a lot of makeup. Wonder why I'm impressed by you dancing on the table, losing all my taste buds. Missing all my morals 'cause they're changing like my fate.
So throughout the 1960s, the energetic bounce in the music scene was carried on and arguably accentuated by a movement called the British Invasion era. Musicians fused pop and rock to fuel the counterculture that emerged in this decade. You might have heard of the repetitive power chords with distorted electric guitars and head-bumping rhythms in the vein of garage rock to highlight the rebellious nature of its decade. With bands such as the Kinks and the Sonics, a new level of energy brought to stage and in some way reflected the culture of breaking away from the mainstream at that time. But then the 1970s switched things up.
No rhythm, I'm lagging. Move feet and now back it. Don't twist up, elastic. It's the place to find the nasty. Y'all can't stop me sleeping under candelas. Join from the stars and shade it with umbrellas. Shape the mold of my mind. Instruct noises you find. Keep it posted when you realize that we're moving with time. Senorita, low, with it up. No goes on, burn up, private highway, no turns on. No rhythm, I'm lagging. Move feet and now back it. Go twist up, elastic. It's the place to find the nasty.
The 1970s was arguably a very important decade as it popularized the new wave of disco. The African-American swing was mixed with impressively smooth riffs on the synthesizers and electric guitars. This went hand in hand with the American nightlife, driving forward the culture of freeform dancing and loud, expressive music. Hopefully this shines through with the pitch-bending synths and regular hitting drums, giving a strutting sensation in the rhythm that accompanies the funky melodies. But in the 1980s, these funky, soulful components bled into the pop mainstream. As funk and disco culture grew, came the emergence of dance music and new wave in the 1980s. With the rise of pop music and commercial bangers, stars like Michael Jackson dominated the music scene, putting funk and disco components into the mainstream. Using catchy and repetitive riffs behind groovy drum patterns, I tried to resonate the 1980s pop feel by building a beat behind a snappy trumpet sample, whilst accompanying the instrumental with punchy vocals and lyrics. The 1990s, however, followed with an emergence of fringe music.
Silhouette of my shadow, I can't see it behind me. Ball and chain that rattles as it locks right onto my feet. Getting lighter, ooh, it's getting lighter. By the day I'm feeling higher, losing sleep over the things that never mattered. Always changes style so it never gets boring. I wanna switch back to when everything was on normal. Back when socks rolled up and my shoes weren't tight. But now my door's so shut, I can't figure out what's behind it. Gave it all I got, there's nothing left, maybe that's best for me. Rewind the clock so that I'm not lost in my memories. But I carry the burden of a spinning head and a mindset that's turning when there's nothing there. Turntables turning, how times can change on a journey. Studio rat, I'm not vermin, but I will take every crumb I can get.
In 1993, the World Wide Web was launched to the public. It reframed how the audience could find and listen to music, and people had access to much wider range of different styles of music. That's why niche and new genres became much more popular faster than they did ever before. However, arguably the biggest influence of this decade was hip-hop and rap, predominantly by rappers like Ice Cube, Jay-Z, or Snoop Dogg. And to replicate this, I played a simple melody on an old-school type piano to sit behind some old swinging boom-bap drums. Then, by the 2000s, this kind of music hit the mainstream.
Now plethora on plethora, I'm ridden with hysteria. Climbing up the tree, forget I'm climbing up forever. Shout out, root out, berry. Someone ever so wary. Take the time to fake what's mine to rid the minds of what might carry. Hold up, I don't wanna crash, not when I ain't steering. Sat up in the back, I got my hands up to the ceiling. So what? I wanna roll up, cruising, getting slower. Wheels losing faith, but I think I'm going forward. Sights I've never seen this. Wasted memories. All I can say is ready to go. Now this brighter side of me hides the dopamine. Oh, one day it overflows.
The 2000s had prominent artists such as the Black Eyed Peas and Outkast, who brought a hip-hop bounce to mainstream pop. Implementing a tasteful balance of electronic and acoustic instruments brought forward radio hits and carried the swing that boom-bap beats had. By blending both rap and pop catchy vocals, bands such as the Black Eyed Peas became household names amongst the commercial music scene. In my track, I manipulated real drum sounds to give a bounce to the simple synth riff that I played throughout. The 2010s I found particularly difficult to synthesize into just one short track, however, so I simply followed my own perception of how electronic music dominated the musical scene.
What a fast flash straight toward me. Lights that keep on glowing, like they're coming after me. give a little time to have a better understanding, cause I never dream. Instead I got a Neverland with a frozen chain set around. Can you give a little time to have a better understanding, cause I never dream. Instead I got a Neverland with a frozen chain set a remedy.
In the 2010s, I wanted to focus on the influence and growth of electronic music. With Billboard names such as Kygo, David Guetta, and Tiesto, the music charts were often scattered with EDM. I decided to focus more on Kygo as I believe he provided a unique and recognizable sound. By fusing genres, he provided a gateway for electronic music towards a mainstream audience.
Or you could just bounce, get wavy, pops on the daily forward stance. Get hazy, floor's a little shaky, you go ham, go crazy. Get a little lazy with your plans, so hasty. Walkman like the 80s, yeah, with the devil on my shoulder so shady. Miller in a blue world lately. Listening to you, I'm hesitating, cause I wanna laugh, but my humor so zany. Cats in the bag till I let them all out. Burlap sack and a striped top hat. Let them watch the idol of the whiskers. Now you got me singing green next and I'm in my nightmares. Going in a loop till I cover my peripheral. I'm never in a group, always at my pinnacle. Another good tune, so habitual. A lot of different views, so it's not getting political. You just bounce, yeah, wavy. Pops on the daily for one dance. Get hazy, floor's a little shaky.
We have now reached the end of the musical performance. As you may have seen, music is informed by an array of different events that happen in a certain era or decade, and 2020 is no different. It's definitely shaped my music taste and creative process. And yeah, I love making music. It makes me happy, and I hope that you enjoy these songs that I've made. Here is my song that I made myself called Get Wavy. And yeah, OT, signing out.
Dylan, that was incredible. Now we'll hear from Julia Brahey, a second-year politics and international relations student with a long-standing interest in philosophy. For Julia, realising that our time on Earth is limited can lead to anxiety and perhaps even cause an existential crisis. Today, she poses to us a courageous question. Is it possible to escape time?
If this past year has taught us anything, it's that changes to our routines can have a drastic effect on our lives. I remember how being forcibly confined within my home during the first lockdown had made me realize that all the aspects of my life I deemed to be regular had actually become completely irregular. One of these aspects happened to be time. Now, I know I'm not alone in saying that quarantine has made time feel entirely different than it used to. For me personally, I felt time slipping through my fingers as I succumbed to essay deadlines and an Animal Crossing addiction that took like 6 months to cure. And yet, during this period, I sensed that I had no grasp on my own life. As time continued to pass by me, everything seemed so devoid of purpose. I found myself wandering aimlessly in a world that seemed to age prematurely while I was just struggling to age with it. This realization rendered me so anxious and so frightened that I felt utterly helpless. I began to wonder from that point onwards if there were not a solution to this existential dilemma. I began to wonder if it were not possible to escape time. What does that even mean anyway? Time. Time defines the nature of our existence. We breathe its essence as though it were oxygen. It's like an omnipresent life force that allows us to make sense of a reality that is often so painful to comprehend. It constitutes the framework through which we perceive both the world and ourselves. It was the great philosopher St. Augustine who stated that time for us humans was developed to have a conception of the past, present, and future. and that this would then allow us to have a better perception on the course of our lives. This is significant because this proves that time is inalienably attached to human existence. We cannot break away from its grip. We cannot fight its clasp. We cannot run from its hold on us. And yet, this does not stop us, pesky human beings, from attempting to resist it. We dread time. We flee from it. We try to escape its grasp, despite it being seemingly impossible to do so. You may ask yourselves, if time is so fundamental, if time is so intrinsic to the human experience, then why do we nevertheless fear it? Should we not accept the passing of time with open arms? I mean, it's not like we can stop clocks from ticking or anything, so what about time do we find to be so alarming? The answer lies in one of our most primitive fears, death. We fear death more than we fear anything else. We, as human beings, are biologically engineered to sustain our life to the best of our ability. Our most primal instinct is to protect ourselves from any impending danger that could pose a threat to us. This is important because time effectively corrupts the human body. It ages us, decays us, slowly but surely, until we are but dust and bone. Ultimately, we must come to realize that time is, in fact, the terrifying source of our own mortality. However, is there not a way to escape the pressures that time exerts onto us? Is it not possible to escape time? This fundamentally philosophical question may seem completely unfeasible, utterly impractical, entirely impossible, and yet I will present you with different ways of escaping the clutches of time that are actually accessible to all of us. Just to be clear, my understanding of the ways in which one can escape death are founded in a fully corporal conception, which has little to do with spiritual and religious understandings and beliefs concerning the afterlife. What we must first come to understand is that existence can be defined in different ways. Typically and intuitively, we would say that a being exists through a living entity or body, like you and I right now. However, existence can also embody a non-physical presence, tied to the human mind. Now, think about this. Our minds have the capacity to escape time because they exist independently of our world's physical limitations. I know this may sound puzzling, but allow me to explain further. Although the body can decay, the mind never does. A complete death, in every sense of the term, would embody not only the end of our life within this universe, but the end of our life within it. Death means to have our trace on this world erased. It means to have our mark on the world eradicated. It means to have any influence, any achievement, any memory utterly forgotten. And this point leads me to the first way in which one may escape time. If we are able to utilize our memory to ensure our legacy in our lives past our death, then we can actually escape time. And we can do this through the powerful tool of remembrance. What is remembrance? Remembrance embodies a deliberate effort to ensure the legacy of an individual in order to commemorate their contributions to, let's say, to society, to their families, and even to themselves. Remembrance, if you will, it's like the collectivization of memory, a vessel through which we are able to live through, timelessly. Our existence perseveres through others. Even after we die, our friends will remember us for the many times we made them laugh. Our teachers will remember us for our blossoming dreams and ambitions. Our colleagues will remember us for all the hard work we've placed into our projects. And our children will remember us for the many lessons we have taught them. We remember the smell of our college boyfriend's mac and cheese, just as well as we can remember a Van Gogh painting so beautiful it nearly brought us to tears. I will never forget the endless afternoons I've spent exploring the streets of Paris with my friends and scouting every museum we could afford to go to as mere high schoolers. This is so important because here we understand that every human being has impacted and affected the world that we live in, whether through small actions or monumental achievements. However, as powerful as remembrance may seem, it does have its drawbacks. If memory is not shared with others or passed along to new generations, then it can actually die with the consciousness that contained it. We wouldn't be able to remember our grandmother's beloved apple crumble recipe, just like we wouldn't be able to remember the millions of soldiers that had passed away during wars if their efforts weren't physically materialized. Our grandmother has a recipe, and soldiers have burial sites. In both cases, the lives and legacies of individuals had to be physically materialized for them to truly last through time, as people keeping them in their memories was simply not enough. And this leads me straight to the second way in which one may escape time. The physical realization of human accomplishment can't transcend time because anything materialized does not die the way living beings do. Our trace on the world needs to be externalized for it to truly last through time. Arguably, the most ideal way we would materialize ourselves is by utilizing our minds and our talents for the betterment of society. In this sense, our ideas and our actions become the means through which we're able to resist time. I think it's clear that notable works that people leave behind are a very effective way of escaping time if they are maintained and preserved properly. The most exceptional composers still bring beauty and brilliance to their music, years, often centuries after they've died. The most exceptional artists express their visions through their pieces, inspiring emerging talents of future generations. The most exceptional writers share their understandings and their experiences of the world, adding to the collective account of human experiences. And the most exceptional philosophers help us understand our purpose as human beings, guiding us through the ages. It's clear that certain individuals like Alfred Hitchcock, Johann Sebastian Bach, Frida Kahlo, Jane Austen, and Confucius have effectively escaped the clutches of time through their ability to leave behind notable works. So here, we have effectively established two ways of escaping time: remembrance and the materialization of ideas. However, in our quest to escape time and death, have we not, in some sense, dismissed a much larger issue at hand here? Is it possible that our quest for escapism may lead us down a path of disappointment, disillusionment, and perpetual nihilism? By granting time so much importance, so much power, have we not actually contradicted our original goal. Because in that sense, time would then have even more power over us than we originally intended it for it to have. Our desire for survival and immortality may in fact dismiss the more important aspects of life. It may dismiss the fact that life should be enjoyed to the fullest. Existence is more than just a purely primal state of being. I can prove this. Just close your eyes for a moment. Now, visualize all of the moments in your life in which you've experienced life's joyousness, vibrancy, and exhilaration. A serene morning walk, a lovely dinner with friends, or your long-expected graduation. These moments, they embody significance, purpose, and meaning. If we were truly the sum of our most basic functions, then we would not revel in the beauty of a sunset that paints the sky gold. We would not savor a meal that reminds us of home every time we took a bite. We would not feel immense joy at the very idea of being held in our partner's arms. We would not find hope in moments that seem hopeless. How do we come to terms with the fact that all of these beautiful moments in our lives will eventually fade away and disappear? The answer lies in the rather exceptional story. Long ago, a man born into royalty, wealth, and power lives a life of distinction and privilege. He lives an utterly sheltered existence, confined within palace walls under the rule of his authoritarian father. Despite his prosperity, he remains adventurous, curious of the outside world he was forbidden from exploring. And one day, against his family's wishes, he decides to venture out into the outside world, leaving his life of privilege behind him, naively enthusiastic of the adventures that lay ahead. This enthusiasm is quickly tarnished as he is faced with the horrors of the outside world. As he explores the streets of his city, he is faced with poverty, disease, suffering. Death becomes a part of his existence. He becomes totally disillusioned with his previous life in which he was effectively shielded from such horrors. He comes to the conclusion that life is nothing but suffering and relinquishes any aspects of his life, like luxury or pleasure. And yet, his story does not stop there. He soon comes to realize that although life and existence is inherently filled with misery, it is not solely defined by this. We experience pain, yet this does not define us as human beings. The man comes to understand that life can also be the bearer of wisdom and illumination. He accepts that death is a natural part of life and finds higher enlightenment in several practices that would later become intrinsically linked with this philosophy. This man's name was Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the Buddha. The Buddha's story pertains to our deeply ingrained fears regarding the passage of time. We are desperate to view life through an overwhelmingly positive lens. For this reason, we hope that joyous moments in our life last. We cherish them and we long to experience them again, because these are the things that make living life worthwhile. However, we are bound to experience hardships, discomfort, and despair. And unfortunately, our fervent desire to only experience the positive in life has an unintended negative consequence. The hardships we are bound to face become even more disparaging. However, if we can embrace the fact that life can be as beautiful as it can be ugly, as pleasant as it can be arduous, and that death is a part of life, we will come much closer to softening the ravages of time. It is possible to escape time through legacy, influence, memory, and notable works, yet we should never make this our central purpose in life, like a goal to achieve or a treasure to seek, as this ultimately diminishes the joys of human existence. To constantly focus on our impending deaths dismisses the fact that life should be lived to the fullest. For using the time we have wisely, understanding that life is as light as it can be dark, and endeavoring to ensure that the lives of those around us, those that we love, improve more and more each day, may be the only way in escaping its tight grasp. Thank you to the American Library in Paris for allowing me to use this space for this talk, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Julia, for that wonderfully poetic, inspiring talk. Next up, we have Harry Law, a first-year theatre and performance student. Harry has a vision of a future with universal coordinated time. He began thinking about this when he realised that time zones had been politically weaponised and were in fact causing us biological harm. Throughout this talk, Harry will explore whether it's time for us to get rid of these time zones. Without further ado, here's Harry Law.
Time is arguably our most valuable resource. With challenges facing us today such as global, irreversible climate change, now more than ever, we need to make the best use of our time. But what if I told you that every single day we wake up and we reinforce a system which has been scientifically proven to stop us from doing so by biologically limiting us? A system that has been politically weaponized time and time again. I'm talking about time zones. In recent years, time zones have gone from being a standardized measurement of distance from GMT to a vastly complicated but fascinating display of political and economic alliances. The most recent example of this comes from 2011, when Kiribati leaped to the other side of the international date line and changed its time zone by a whopping 23 hours in order to match the date of its oceanic neighbours Australia and New Zealand, in order to have improved business communications. This poses the question, do we need new time zones? Or better yet, do we need time zones at all? What if we were to implement a worldwide system of universal coordinated time, or UTC for short?
To properly understand our need for a universal time zone, we've first got to take a brief look at the history of standardized time. Currently, every country in the world uses a time zone based on an offset from Greenwich Mean Time, a time zone based on the prime meridian that runs through Greenwich in the UK. For example, New York runs at an offset of -5, which means that the clocks in New York run 5 hours earlier than the clocks here in Britain.
GMT was adopted as the world's first standardized time in 1880 due to the emergence of the railway system in Britain and the vast amount of scheduling errors that a lack of standardized time brought on. Before this, passengers would often find themselves missing trains because clocks in various towns and cities would run a few minutes apart. By 1929, most countries had a time zone based on an hourly offset from GMT. However, it took until 1986 for every country to do so, when Nepal adopted a bizarre 15-minute offset, setting their clocks 5 hours and 45 minutes ahead of GMT. This odd deviation from the hourly offsets brings me to my next point. There's a lot wrong with time zones. Most of them don't even accurately represent time geographically whatsoever. Russia currently has 11 time zones, whereas China, for the sake of unity, has just one. Despite only being 1.8 times the size of China, Russia has 11 times the number of time zones. Clearly, this isn't an accurate system. Nowadays, the only purpose that time zones serve are making political statements. Governments will toy around and change our schedules for no actual benefit other than making a petty political point. China recently arrested a Uyghur Muslim for having his watch set to Urumqi time, a local time used in the West where the sun rises and sets much later. Other countries have also modified their time zones to show political independence. North Korea recently celebrated the 70th anniversary of Korea's liberation from Japan by setting their clocks back half an hour, distancing themselves from Japan and South Korea, and creating what they called Pyongyang time. Besides being used as political weaponry, another key problem with our time zones is that they wreak havoc on the human body. The human body is regulated by dozens of circadian rhythms that dictate everything from when we feel alert and awake to when we feel hungry. These are also managed by our internal body clock, which reacts to external cues such as light and darkness or sunrise and sunset. Our time zones mess this up entirely by forcing us to wake and eat and work at times that don't match our internal body clock. Take the country of Spain, for example. They operate on Central European time, despite being very far to the west of Europe. This causes later sunrises, putting people out of sync with their internal body clock. This has been proven to lead to severe sleep deprivation, which causes both physical and mental health detriments. So I want to ask you, why do we have to do this? What can we do instead? I want to talk today about a radical idea that could potentially solve all these problems. UTC.
UTC stands for Coordinated Universal Time, and you may be thinking, none of those letters match up. You'd be right. The acronym is actually a compromise between French and English speakers, a mix between Universal Coordinated Time and Temps Universel Cordon. Semantics aside, UTC is, simply put, a worldwide universal time zone. Every clock in the world, from the phone in my pocket to your grandfather's pocket watch, all showing the same time. If it's 6 PM in London, 6 PM in Los Angeles.
UTC is actually already used worldwide by pilots, who refer to it as Zulu, which admittedly does sound a lot cooler. They use it due to the potential difficulties when trying to organise international flights going across various different time zones. The idea of implementing UTC worldwide was first popularised by two physicists, Steve Hanke and Richard Henry. They argue that the internet has obliterated space and time completely due to the ability it gives us to communicate with anyone, anywhere, instantly. Because of this, our time zones were redundant, as they were created and established far before this, when all activity was local. They also argue that all that time zones are used for nowadays is political leverage, as I mentioned earlier. The main question surrounding implementing UTC is simply, why? Well, let me tell you. Implementing UTC and getting rid of our current time zones could provide us with huge mental and physical health benefits by aligning our sleep schedules with our circadian rhythms, as our waking hours will finally reflect the natural sunset and sunrise pattern. This will come back to benefit us in more ways than just our health. In just 1 year, the United States lost over $433 million in unproductivity caused by time zone related sleep disruption. Overall, it would also make international communication so much easier. If I was to call my family in the United States right now, what I'd have to do is figure out which of the 3 US time zones they're in, perform the calculation between US time and my time, and then figure out whether they'd be awake at that time. With UTC, all I need to do is figure out what time they'd be awake, and I can give them a ring. It's simple, efficient, easy, and it's the best fit for the international society that we currently live in. Obviously, there are a few difficulties we may face trying to implement this system. It will require a radical change in the way that we think about time. When I first discussed this idea with friends and family, I was often met with confusion. Well, if we woke up at 3 AM, wouldn't it be dark out? Standardized time has become so intrinsically linked with our perception of our day. 2 AM means it's dark outside, 7 PM is when you eat dinner, etc., etc. We would also need to implement this system worldwide simultaneously. A universal time zone won't work if a few countries refuse to adopt it. So what do you think? Is it about time we change the way we think about time? UTC could be our way of becoming healthier, wealthier, and more well-rested. All we need to do is implement it. But I'll give you time to think about that for yourselves. Thank you for listening to my talk.
Thank you so much for that talk, Harry. It truly challenged us to think out of the box. And with that, we are now reaching the end of our 2021 student event. On behalf of the entire TEDxWarwick team, I'd like to thank you so much for watching and engaging with this series, and we hope you've learned something new. Thank you also to our speakers for the immense amount of hard work they put into creating their talks. And last but not least, we'd like to draw your attention to our main speaker series, Revival, which is now out on our social media. From this, you can expect weekly TEDx talks from global speakers, all from the comfort of your own home. I encourage you to check this out on our Facebook and Instagram. I hope you have a fantastic weekend, and I hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you.